This is Rick Gray from Fairleigh Dickenson University in Teaneck, New Jersey, USA. I'm here to talk to you about the Brooklyn program. The Brooklyn program was a 16-week substance use treatment program in the Federal Probation Office in Brooklyn, New York. It was designed for the treatment of federal offenders who had been ordered to get treatment, and was designed specifically to deal with non-compliant federal offenders. In the course of our program, we took the radical approach that drugs were not about drugs, that they were about the way people used drugs and what people needed in their lives. And so we created a program that never mentioned drugs beyond the first week, and that taught people how to get in touch with the deepest levels of their own personal directions and personal meanings. The program lasted 16 weeks. Typically, our offenders remained clean after treatment for at least a year. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to follow up beyond the year time frame, but 30% stayed clean, which is as good as the most expensive programs. We got these results using NLP tools with an investment of only 2 hours per week. We extended the program to 16 weeks because we didn't think anyone would believe us if it lasted less than that. And research has shown typically that 16 weeks is about the shortest amount of time that intensive outpatient treatment should be carried forward. The program was rooted in Jungian and Maslowian ideas about the nature of the human condition. Both Maslow and Jung believed that individuals were called to the awakening of a deep identity, and when that identity was awakened, it became self-reinforcing, it provided direction, it tended to draw people into the kinds of directions that depotentiated other kinds of behaviors, other interests, and problems. Of course, it didn't happen in every case, but they predicted that it would happen sufficiently to people who were on the path of self-actualization or individuation that it could be depended upon to drive positive behaviors. Based on that idea, we turned to NLP tools to create states of mind and body that we could use for several purposes. Number one, to change the way people felt immediately. We sought to give people a sense of efficacy with regard to their feelings that would allow them to know that they could feel the way they needed to feel in any given situation. Number two, we used those states of mind and body to create a deep centered state that we called now, that we believe instantiated Jung's idea of the deep self. This served two purposes. Number one, it provided a centered sense, a meditative sense of personal identity that a person could use as a refuge, as a personal compass, as a center from which to act. Number two, it also provided people with an effective route from which they could design futures that were meaningful to them on a deep personal level. Both Jung and later writers, including Peter Lang, suggested that behavior was always implied by emotion. On the Jungian end, that has been expanded into archetypal patterns of movement and action. Lang wrote that emotional memories are complexes of neural traces that include semantic definitions, emotional contexts, and expected behaviors. He pointed out that the expected behaviors were more predictable with regard to negative emotions, but he indicated that strong positive emotions also tended to carry with them the sense of movement and direction and action. Based on this, we used anchors and enhanced states, and that deep state called now, as a foundation for using smart outcomes to create a personally relevant, meaningful, irresistible future using the smart outcome strategy from NLP. Our program was designed to deal with people who we predicted were going to be uncooperative. Our population consisted of federal offenders. Most of them were expected to be non-compliant. Many of them had already been through various forms of drug treatment. We decided to create a program that would depotentiate any form of resistance and provide them with tools that they could use to develop a sense of personal efficacy with regard to emotion and self-directedness. We began the program with a brief introduction but at that time we promised our client population that we would talk no more about drugs during the entire program. What we promised them was this: number one, the program would count as drug treatment. Number two, that we would not talk to them about drugs, but we would teach them, one, how to enhance their memory, two, how to have more control over their feelings, including how to feel the way they wanted to feel when they wanted to feel, and three, we would teach them how to develop a personal sense of direction, a sense of a series of personal outcomes that they would find personally rewarding and meaningful. At the same time, we promised them that we would not tell them what to do with these tools. We promised them that if they did what we instructed them to do, they would always feel better than when they came in. That if they didn't do what we told them to do, they could be assured of having the most boring 2 hours of their entire week. Typically, we got 75% completion. And as I said before, 30% of people who had tested positive for drugs either before or during the program remained drug-free for at least a year after treatment. There are several influences beyond Jung and Maslow that were important to the program. One of the most important foundations was the work of Prochaska, Norcross, and DiClemente. In the stages of change, they set out the trans-theoretical model of change, which has become the most well-studied, the most well-validated, and perhaps the most important way of managing change and motivation in the world today. We know it mostly as the stages of change model. In the years before the publication of their popular book, Changing for Good, Prochaska promulgated what he called the strong principle of change. He found that people involved in change who had a future hope of some positive outcome that was more personal, more meaningful, and more powerfully motivating than the problem behavior would spontaneously move more quickly through the stages between contemplation and action than people who did not. Hope was a very important part of change. Knowing where you wanted to be, who you wanted to be, having an outcome was crucial to their model. Looking at this model, of course, Prochaska connected it to health beliefs. But in light of the work of Milton Erickson, who talked about whole life reframes, Miller, who talked about quantum change, and Jung and Maslow, who talked about how contact with the deep self was enough to transform people's lives and move them into a path of growth and development. We understood that a further extension of Prochaska's strong principle of change would allow that any dominant change, any well-formed outcome that was sufficiently deep and powerful and meaningful, accessible to the individual, could reframe addictive behaviors and provide a path to personal growth. This perspective, of course, was prefigured by Bandler and Grinder back in the late 70s, when they said, I believe it was in reframing, just that addictions could be solved by providing the patient with a more meaningful, a more effective, and more immediate way of being in the world than that provided by the drugs. That became our aim. So we have these two influences. Our outcome is to provide people with an outcome that is sufficiently meaningful to them that it will drive change. A second outcome is to give them tools and a sense of efficacy about meaning, about feeling, about being in the world. And we believe that this would enhance choice. It would enhance their capacity to make choices. Richard Davidson, the neuroscientist at Madison, Wisconsin, tells us the left orbitofrontal cortex, as part of the midbrain dopamine system, instantiates hierarchies of motivation, of incentive salience, such that those things that are more reinforcing, more personal, more visceral, more accessible, and more reliable move higher in that hierarchy than those things that are less accessible, impactful, valuable. This falls right in line with Prochaska's observation, and is exactly what we seek to do in this program. To create something for each person, or allow them to create it, that is meaningful to them, capable of driving them to become their very best. Another outcome has to do with efficacy, has to do with the possibility of choosing how I want to feel and how I want to be in the world. That hierarchy responds to choices. It responds to options. We know that intrinsic motivators are incredibly powerful. And so part of our aim is to provide feedback for intrinsic motivations that work towards outframing addictive behaviors on a day-to-day basis, along with the creation of that instantiation of the deep self, and the complex anchor that we call now, that will ultimately be used to create a well-formed outcome that can drive growth and development across time and place. Well, the program starts by teaching our offenders submodality enhancement of resources. And of course, Erickson tells us that every memory is a positive resource. Damasio tells us that every memory and every fantasy experience is a creation, in fact, of a real emotional experience. And by taking the simplest of emotional experiences, applying to them submodality techniques, we can expand them, enhance them to the point where any behavior can become, any affect can become fundamentally archetypal in its intensity. James Hillman, the founder of archetypal psychology, he was a training analyst in one of the Jungian institutes, said that any behavior, or affect, if it's sufficiently powerful, takes on the qualities of archetypal energy. What does that mean? It means it becomes numinous, becomes spiritual. It becomes capable of drawing the individual to itself. It becomes the center of attention and motivation. And so by using simple submodality techniques, we can take a simple experience of joy or good decisions or confidence and expand it to the level of what Connie Ray Andreas calls core states. I understand these to be archetypal states. So we would begin by asking the clients to find a resource state, something that felt good, something without any problems attached to it, something that was, for the most part, good and had no baggage. During the first sessions, we don't tell them that it should be clean, legal, and moral, because since we were dealing with offenders, we decided that they would feel really good about it if they thought they were getting over it. And so, during the first several sessions, while we're teaching them the basics of submodality manipulation, they were free to use any kind of emotional experience that they could find, as long as it was positive, in terms of feeling good. And we allowed them to think that they were fooling us. And this ensured their engagement. It disarmed resistance for many of them and got them engaged in the program. They got to see that these techniques work to enhance memory, to enhance the experience of positive affect, and to give them choices about how they were going to feel. In the next several sessions, we began working with a set series of memories. The first, focused attention. Everybody needs focus. The second is a time when they made a good decision. Going to a clothes store, deciding which clothes store, deciding which section of the clothes store, deciding which rack to look in, finding the right style, going through that kind of systematic and coming to the tiny feeling at the end that says, this is the one. That affect can be built into a strong sense of confidence, of knowing that you know that you know that you've decided. The next state that we had them go for was the feeling of streamlining. There's a feeling that all of us have had when what had been a series of discrete movements consolidates into a series of not steps anymore, but a single movement. If you play guitar, you know you learn a riff, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, one note at a time. But after practice, there comes a time when that riff ceases to be one note and it becomes a smooth single movement. Many of you will remember learning to drive a stick shift and the chaos that ensued trying to remember how to press the gas and the clutch and move the gear shift knob at the same time. The car bucks and complains and screeches to a halt and shakes the teeth out of your mouth. But then there comes a moment when it all slides together. And growing from there, you have the sense of things coming together. That's good, we called it. Then fun was another one. An experience of just plain fun, of joy, possibly. However small, however tiny, maybe just the enjoyment of a laugh 10 minutes before could be expanded to an experience of ecstasy. The final state was a feeling of confidence, being able to do something repeatedly, reliably, that you've done over and over and over again, like a taxi cab driver winding through the streets of New York City, drinking a soda and having a conversation at the same time. Each of these states was ramped up, enhanced to the point where it became ecstatic, enhanced to the point where the affect was separate from the memory source itself. And that was always the key to getting these states to the right place. It was no longer about the memory, it was about doing the feeling itself. Having created those 5 states, we then taught the clients to connect those states to simple Pavlovian conditioned stimuli. The stimuli were typically hand gestures, very simple. Down the hand of the non-dominant, down the fingers of the non-dominant hand, focus, solid, good, fun, yes, for each of them. We designed it so it would be simple, easy to remember, unobtrusive. Instead of the standard NLP practice of anchoring that sometimes requires conscious control by the person who is being anchored, we asked our subjects to do a classical Pavlovian paradigm. They would access the state, make the gesture, enhance the state a little more, let go of the anchor, enjoy the state, shake it out, and do it again. After 5 or 6 repetitions, they would notice that the finger gesture itself evoked the state, and then they knew they had it. From that point on, it became a trigger that they could use to evoke the state whenever they pleased. Once those states were established, we stacked them into a single anchor that we called now. We believed the now state was an instantiation of the Jungian idea of the deep self, which is the center, the director of human behavior, the awakener of human potentials. And from that now state, we would then use the SMART outcome, the well-formedness conditions, 4 outcomes from NLP, to create futures in 5 different domains of life. We would ask our clients to fire off now and to imagine themselves 5 years in the future. I would ask them to imagine that future in terms of personal relationships, in terms of spiritual relations and values, in terms of intellectual behaviors, in terms of vocation, and in terms of health behaviors. For each of these, they would develop a well-formed outcome. But this outcome would be personally meaningful to them because it is rooted in that deep sense of self that we had worked to develop. It became self-motivating, autotelic, in the words of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It set up the conditions for a life lived out in flow. And for those people that successfully completed the program, typically, it had those effects. Now, there were other parts of the program, but these are the most salient features. And what we found is that over and over and over again, our clients would come back to us and tell us, number one, they would thank us for giving them back to themselves. And that was a very important part of what I saw our mission as being. Number two, early on in the program, once the anchors began to be established independently, they would go out and spontaneously begin using them, typically to overcome road rage. It was striking how many people came in and said, Dr. Gray, some guy cut me off, and instead of flipping out, I fired off the anchor, and it wasn't important. One multiple bank robber who had violated the terms of his parole enough times that he had done 10 or 15 years on parole that originally was to terminate after 5, came in one day after learning just the basic anchors to say that he had gone to his cop spot. And I asked him, well, he said, yeah, I went down there. And I said, what happened? He said, I got confused. I asked, what did you do? He said, I left. I congratulated him. After completing the program, for the first time in 15 years, he was able to complete parole, get a regular job, and as far as I know, and it's been a minimum of 6 years, he has been problem-free. It's not a panacea, but these are some of the kinds of effects that we have gotten and gotten consistently with program completers. There's another population within the program of people who had to take the program because they may have walked past some drugs, or a judge was sure that they were addicted because sometime in their far past they had taken some drugs. Those people often did very well in terms of finding their own direction, awakening to a deep spirituality, finding new ways of being in the world that was much more satisfying, that were much more satisfying than the old ways. It's a program with multiple applications. I'd invite you to email me at rmgray@fdu.edu and I would be happy to send you a free PDF copy of the manual. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you. Have a great conference. Goodbye.